AP Biology. First, I'd like you to do this warm-up question for each of the diagrams shown. Determine if the process is active or passive transport. So, is this one active or passive? Is this one active or passive? Is this one active or passive? How about this one? So all of these are active transport. This one down here is obviously active transport because you have ATP here driving it, and it's pumping hydrogen ions. And so the hydrogen ions are moving up their concentration gradient and making this side of the membrane more positively charged and this side of the membrane negatively charged. And once you have that, it's called an electrochemical gradient. It's a chemical gradient because it's got hydrogens concentrated on one side. It's also electrical because of the charge separation. And then if you have that charge separation, you can use the energy in that charge separation with a channel protein, and then things that are charged like potassium will be, because potassium is positively charged, it will be downhill energetically for them to move through that channel protein. So that's a form of what we call secondary active transport. In this case down here, we have nitrate moving up its concentration gradient in a protein that grabs hydrogen ions and uses the downward motion of the hydrogen ions to pull nitrate up their concentration gradient. And then finally, we have sucrose here being moved up its concentration gradient by tapping the hydrogen ions. So all three of these are active transport, and they're coupled to this hydrogen pump by ATP. So one of the questions which is a central question for this particular talk, is how the heck do you get water from the ground all the way up to the leaves of a tree? And there are two answers to this. One is a smaller contributor than the other, but to understand the first one, you have to understand a little bit about how the root is organized. And so the root has an epidermal layer that's in contact with the soil, and then it has an endodermis, which is inside and covered with a waxy strip called the Casparian strip. And this means that water, this outer layer here, serves as a sponge, and water gets soaked up inside of cells. And if it's inside of cells, it can go through a pathway through things called plasmodesmata, which are links between the cytoplasm of the cells. Or it can go between the cells, but once it gets to the Casparian strip, it has to go across a membrane. And so because there are so many membranes here, each of these membranes can have little pumps on them to bring into the cell things like nitrate and potassium and other things in the soil that the plant needs. And the whole goal then is to move this stuff into the vascular tissue, or the xylem of the cell. So what's the benefit of having all these different cells here with pumps? Okay, you should have said that it was to increase the surface area, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention that most plants have fungi associated with their roots called mycorrhizae, and mycorrhizal plants, or mycorrhizal fungi, if you look at this, the white stuff here is all fungus, and then the other stuff here is plant tissue, and this is a plant root tip, so plant root hair that's covered with mycorrhizal fungi. And the point here, if you look, what would you say the difference is between the white mycorrhizal fungi, and the plant root. So you should note that the plant root's much larger in diameter than the mycorrhizal fungi, and this is a benefit because the smaller the diameter is, the higher the surface area to volume ratio is. So fungi are much better at absorbing things than plants can be, and this is why most of them have this beneficial relationship where the fungus absorbs things like water, ammonia, other nutrients, and then the plant gives the fungus a little bit of sugar in exchange. So it's a win-win. Okay, all of this leads to all this leads to an increase in solute inside the xylem, and because there's higher concentration of solute inside the xylem than in the surrounding water, or than in the surrounding soil, water will flow into the xylem, and then it will push the it will push the it will push the flow up. And this video here that's not loading is called guttation, and what happens in this, I'll put a link in the comments section for you so you can see it happen. But this leads to, this is a vascular tissue here, and this is the end of the vascular tissue on this particular leaf, and little drops will form. This is called root pressure, and for small plants, it can, short plants, it can contribute really a lot to moving water through the plant. Guttation, in the morning before the sun comes out, guttation can lead to little drips of water forming on the ends of the vascular tissue. Okay, and so the other part is called transpirational pull, and transpirational pull is basically the idea that water, because it's cohesive, will be pulled through the xylem from where there's a lot of water to where there's a very little water, and there's very little water in the air. So here we have a leaf, and we're looking at a cross section of a leaf, and notice that there are these little holes here. These holes are called stomata, and stomata are where carbon dioxide comes in, oxygen goes out, and water is also going to leave the plant through the stomata. Water evaporates in this airspace in here, and then when it evaporates, it's going to leave the plant into the air where there's less water, and so as long as the air has less water than the soil, water is going to be pulled up the plant. And we'll talk in some detail in the problem. There's a problem set that I'll give you that will talk in detail about water potential. But you can think of water potential as the more negative the water potential, the less water there is in that particular area, and water is going to flow from where there's more water to where there's less water. And there's less water in the air, and that's what the primary force that causes water to go from the soil up to the leaf. Now, lots of things can affect the rate of transpiration. The opening of the stomata, closing of the stomata, atmospheric pressure, a whole number of other things that you can read here. How much light there is, whether the wind's blowing, even the shape of the leaf can affect the rate of transpiration. And rate of transpiration is important because, in plants, in areas where there's not much water, you want to conserve water. So in the desert plants in arid areas are going to want to use as little water as they can. On the other hand, plants that live in kind of swampy areas, like one real good example of this is poplar trees. They have leaves that kind of kind of waste water in a way. But that's okay, because they tend to live in areas where there's plenty of water. And um, so the main way that the plant on a day-to-day basis can control how much water it loses is through these little things called stomata. So in here, this little hole goes into the space that cavity inside the plant leaf, and they're controlled by these two things called guard cells. This stomata is open, and this one we would call closed, although notice that there's a little gap there. So when we talk about open and closed, it's not like it's binary. Plants have really pretty fine control over how open and closed they can make their stomata. But an open stomata, obviously, going to do more gas exchange and therefore lose more water. Closed stomata, going to lose less water, but then if the plant's doing photosynthesis, there's going to be a buildup of oxygen inside its cavity, and that can be really bad for other reasons. Um, Photorespiration is the main reason that's a problem. You can look that up if you'd like. I'm not going to talk about it now. The other, so it's like it's holding its breath, but if it's holding its breath to try to keep water, if water's hard to come by, that's a good idea. And so here's how this works. When guard cells are turgid, uh, the the stomata will be open, and if they're flaccid, the stomata will be closed. It makes sense, right? If you have a lot of water, it's pretty easy to keep your guard cells turgid. If you don't have much water, they can go flaccid pretty easily. So if you think about it, that's what the plant would want to do. All right, and so how does it control this? Well, primarily potassium gets pumped across membranes, and so when there's a signal that the plant needs to close its stomata, it'll pump potassium into the cells. Uh, I'm sorry. Uh, when it wants to open its stomata, it will pump potassium into the guard cells, and that will make water follow them, and therefore that'll be turgid. They'll be turgid, and it'll open the stomata. When it needs to close stomata, it will release the potassium from the cells, from the guard cells, and water will follow it out. The cells will get flaccid, and the stomata will be closed. Now there's a there's a video that I'll post that I did before with a balloon where I showed a way to really kind of see this in action, and I'll put the link in the comments section. Finally, I talked about how some plants do some anatomical things to conserve water, and in this case, this is a plant that lives in an arid area. And notice how you might think that this is a stomata, but it's actually not. This is like a cavity in the plant leaf, and then the stomata are back in here. So not only are the stomata back in here, there are also little hairs in this hole, and so I'd like you to think about, how can that help conserve water. And so you should say that the hairs are going to prevent airflow, and so you're going to have a high humidity area in here. Also, this cavity will restrict the flow of water, moisture out of this cavity as well. And so um, this plant, it has some other adaptations like a thick cuticle, but this plant is pretty well adapted to conserving water.